O'Malley, and we are here today to discuss docket number 1096, which is regarding local wetlands protection legislation. This is a hearing order that was authored by my dear colleague and friend, City Councilor at Large Michelle Wu. I want to thank, of course, Councilor Wu for introducing this hearing and for her partnership on this and so many incredible and effective environmental initiatives. I want to thank members of the Rosendale Wetlands Task Force for their efforts in wetlands preservation and plant and wildlife protection. The Rosendale Wetlands, I spent many days as I was growing up. My grandparents lived on Coniston Road, which abuts it. It's a wonderful place that is very important to me personally and professionally. As the chairman of the Environment, Sustainability and Parks Committee, I'm encouraged to explore any additional measures to ensure our urban environmental landscape is preserved. Wetlands are land areas that fluctuate with seasonal water levels. Coastal wetlands include Atlantic beaches, tidal pools, bays, and inlets, as well as salt marshes. We have a number of wetlands throughout the city of Boston, including in District 6 and neighboring District 5. We want to make sure that we can protect them to the threats, man-made and otherwise, development and otherwise, to make sure that we can they protect them as it relates to flood control, prevention of pollution, protection of public and private water supplies, groundwater supplies, fisheries, land, and wildlife habitat, among others. So I'm now going to turn it over, before I turn it over to the chief author, Councilor Wu, I want to remind everybody that this is a streamed and televised hearing happening right now. There are sign-in sheets up to my left at the end. We will stay here as long as it takes. If people would like to testify, please sign up. We're going to have a couple of panels. First, we're going to have the city's panel, but before I get to Commissioner Spector, I want to invite the lead author, Councilor Wu, if she has any opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Carl and Amelia and everyone else for joining us. I am excited about the prospect of talking through this. I know this has been something, wetlands protection legislation has been something that the city has been looking at for a number of years now, and I just wanted to give credit where credit's due. David Morgan from my office, who has been with us over the summer, is really the lead author on this and has even started thinking about potential next steps. So he was informed shortly before this that he will be on the next panel as well. So we'll get to grill him on everything that he's been working on this summer. But it all falls into the same bucket that Councilor O'Malley and I have been pushing on, which is that given the current environment, it is up to the city, and particularly the city of Boston, to take leadership and do whatever we can to fight climate change and set an example for other cities. So I know in broad strokes that this is one more avenue in which we could take very short, if not an immediate action, and that Boston is one of only 3 coastal communities in Massachusetts that has not taken this type of action. So there's a lot of room to fill in details about what the shape of potential wetlands protection ordinance might look like, but this is something that affects all of the city, each one of our city council districts, and I believe could have great impact for stabilizing our ability to fight climate change and adapt to the changing weather patterns we're already seeing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. We've also been joined by my dear friend and colleague, the District 2 City Councilor Ed Flynn. Councilor Flynn, any opening remarks or thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Councilor O'Malley, and thank you, Councilor Wu, for your strong leadership on this issue. As many of you know, the city has been impacted more frequently with extreme storms. Just last winter, we saw 3 nor'easters in the span of a few weeks. My district covers a significant portion of the waterfront. During these storms, we received calls about flooding from residents in South Boston, Fort Point, and the waterfront district. It is important that we act now to ensure proper protections for our city. I believe we must take every action possible to protect our residents and our city. Natural barriers like our wetlands must be protected, and we must ensure those building along the waterfront use the best available science and data as well. Coastal storm flowage must be addressed when developers build. Again, I want to say thank you to Mayor Walsh for his leadership in this issue. I want to say thank you to Councilor Wu, Councilor O'Malley, and I look forward to hearing more about this issue today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Welcome, Commissioner Carl Spector. Welcome, Amelia. Amelia, I'm sorry, I didn't get your last name.
Croto.
I'm Amelia Croto, Carl Spector. Welcome. Carl, do you have any opening comments or thoughts before we get to questions?
Right, thank you, Councillor. Yes, I'm Carl Spector. I am Commissioner of the Environment for the City of Boston, and with me is Amelia Croto, who is Executive Secretary of the Conservation Commission, who I brought with me in case you have any specific questions on the current jurisdiction and activities of the Conservation Commission and our enforcement of the State Wetlands Protection Act. Wetlands and other green and open spaces, as you've mentioned, provide many important benefits to the Boston community: stormwater management, wildlife habitat, heat mitigation, recreation and beauty, and more. For this reason, the Boston Conservation Commission protects wetlands through its enforcement of the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. The Wetlands Protection Act recognizes 8 important wetland functions and 17 specific types of wetland resource areas that need protection. Under the Act, Boston may create a local wetlands ordinance that can provide even stronger protection than those available under state law. Wetlands in Boston are subject to many pressures, including the effects of climate change, especially sea level rise. For this reason, developing a framework for greater wetland protection is already part of the Greenovate Boston Climate Action Plan. The 2014's preparedness section includes the action expand green infrastructure requirements, such as through a local wetlands ordinance. This was expanded in the 2016 Climate Ready Boston report, which included an initiative to develop a wetlands protection action plan with a local wetlands ordinance as a possible component of such a plan. Members of the Environment Department, the Parks and Recreation Department, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and other offices have been engaged in discussions on what the specific provisions of a wetlands ordinance might be, and particularly how it would relate to other climate initiatives that the city has underway. We welcome the opportunity to work with you, with other members of the council, and with the many stakeholders who will be interested in further development of a proposal on this subject. As we consider the possibility of a local ordinance, we should keep in mind that sea level rise and its effects, important as they are not the only subjects that could be addressed. Several years ago, the Conservation Commission held a series of public hearings to recommend guidelines to then Mayor Thomas Menino for developing a local ordinance. I cannot say whether those recommendations represent the views of the current commission, but they are nonetheless instructive. In addition to provisions that incorporate sea level rise into the protection of wetlands, the recommendations included an expansion both in the number of wetland functions and in the number of resource areas that should receive protections. Such measures could address some non-climate related challenges that the Commission has encountered. Finally, we should be diligent to ensure that the procedures required by any ordinance are as fair and efficient as possible. And we need to consider the effects of any change in jurisdiction and requirements on the capacity and resources of the Conservation Commission. In its existing jurisdiction, several thousand parcels of lands are already subject to oversight by the Commission. If we expand that number, we want to be able to continue to provide the effective regulation and efficient review that together ensure protection of the public interest and respect the interests of property owners. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Ms. Croteau, any opening thoughts? Or
I do not. No.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to let the lead sponsor sort of lead the questioning, but just very briefly, Carl, you mentioned in 2013 the Conservation Commission began the process of sort of drafting a ordinance. Wetlands protection?
Well, they presented to Mayor Menino their recommendation on guidelines for drafting an ordinance.
Okay.
If you've
a meeting about the meeting, essentially.
Well, it was a very broad framework for the type of changes that the Commission at that time thought would be important to make, or the provisions that they thought would be important to add to the authorities that we already had under the state law.
Sure, and then that just has been put on ice?
Well, as I said, we've had discussions over the years about how to develop an ordinance. Obviously, we haven't been able to present one. The mayor's not been able to present one to the council yet. Obviously, we have been engaged in a few other climate resilience-related activities during that time, so it's not as if we're not paying attention to this important issue.
Well, that's I appreciate that. Councilor Wu, do you want to get into the questioning?
Sure. So thank you again, Carl. That was really helpful to understand the context. And we know, because it feels like we see you every other week here, that we're working on a lot together.
Always a pleasure.
Yes. And again, we'll hear from the next panel some thoughts they have. So I see our role and, my office's efforts in bringing this forward as trying to supplement and, where possible, fill in some of the resource gaps in terms of our intentions all matching up, but us being able to help advance some of the legislative work, which is our bread and butter on the council side. But just to take one step back and really understand what exactly we're talking about and what the impact might be, does the Environment Department have a full inventory of all the areas that are designated that could be considered wetlands under the state act, and what would potentially also fall under that if we used city ordinance to expand that to its fullest potential?
Well, first of all, so maybe Amelia can answer do we have an inventory of the current at wetlands in current jurisdiction?
Yeah, the current maps that we use are from the state, so anything that's listed on Mass DEP Oliver. And then whenever we have a developer come before us, the Conservation Commission, if they're in an area that's particularly vulnerable, then we're going to ask that they do a wetland site assessment.
And so how many sites are there about?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
Okay, but
I mean, we've...
Currently, we have jurisdiction over 6.9 square miles of the city.
Okay, and then, of course, through the Climate Ready Boston initiative, we have identified those areas that we think are likely to be in the floodplain with up to 40 inches of sea level rise. And so we have an estimate of the amount of land that would be then come under, would come under Conservation Commission jurisdiction under the current law if we sort of moved it forward in time. And so depending on how one might define an expanded jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission to take into account projected sea level rise and projected areas of flooding, we could develop an estimate of how much land would be, could possibly be under the jurisdiction of the commission.
okay, so let's start there. So basically, the ways that we could add more either teeth or oversight to the Conservation Commission and the city's ability to think about climate resiliency, specifically around wetlands, are to change or interpret the definition of vulnerable areas differently using the future projections, and that would not require an additional ordinance. That would just be an administrative practice.
No, that would probably, I believe, subject all to further analysis.
Okay.
I think that would require a change in the ordinance because
Okay.
under the current ordinance, the land subject to coastal storm flowage, which is what we're talking about, is defined by the floodplain, which is the current 1% probability flooding area.
Got it, okay. And so what are the additional ways that either the administration or the Conservation Commission in particular have thought about expanding jurisdiction? So the definitions, the projections relative to floodplain, but also considering more impacts in terms of the permitting process and what you would be able to mandate?
Well, so one of the ideas that we have been considering is to start to take into, as I said, to start taking into consideration the projected levels of flooding with some amount of sea level rise. So, as I said, in Climate Ready Boston and in all the planning work that we're doing now, we're looking at 40 inches of sea level rise. So if, for example, this is one way of approaching it, we started to include future areas of floodplain into the jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission. That might be one way of expanding the analysis and the areas that the Conservation Commission looks at. I know there have been there are other ways of doing it. I know some jurisdictions have simply changed their floodplain definition from the 100-year storm, the 1% chance of flood, to the 500-year storm, the 0.2% chance of flood as a mechanism for expanding what the Conservation Commission looks like, or to look at the way that certain wetland areas or certain resource areas might move with climate change and things like that. So there are several different approaches that one could take. I mean, if we move into an ordinance, obviously this is something that we would need to discuss and really figure out what makes sense for the city of Boston, both in terms of policy and in terms of the behavior of natural systems and, in our jurisdictional capacity.
So in addition to different ways to expand the jurisdiction with the current tools that the Conservation Commission has, have you thought about ways to add new tools or make those tools stronger regardless of what the area is?
I'm not sure what you're referring to as tools, I'm sorry.
Okay, so for example, right now, when a developer comes before the commission, what are they asked to do by the Conservation Commission?
They have to submit everything that's required by the state, plus a few other items that the Conservation Commission asked for. Detailed narrative plans, things like that. But like I said, if there is a sensitive area within their development site, we're going to ask that they do a wetland determination.
And what do you ask for, or what goes into that determination?
It depends on the site, but usually like a habitat assessment, vegetation assessment, hydrology, things like that.
So basically, the Conservation Commission is looking to ensure that the existing resource areas, the wetlands, on any parcel of land are being protected, and that the values specified, water quality protection, flooding protection, are being maintained by any development, by any changes that are taking place on that parcel of land.
And so the process of you asking for that determination and then taking a vote on approval or disapproval, how binding is that, or is it similar to the climate resiliency checklist at the BPDA, which is in some ways more voluntary, or is it stronger than that?
Well, it is stronger. It is a binding legal document. It's a permit with conditions, and that the property owner is required to show that that the development, whatever it is, takes place in accordance with those conditions that are in the permit.
Okay.
I should add that the climate checklist that's part of the Article 80 review process is also now submitted to the Conservation Commission as part of the information that they request. There are no, and Amelia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there are no specific performance requirements that are associated with the projected levels of flooding and sea level rise that we, the city as a whole, ask developers to inform us about in relation to new developments and climate change. But the Conservation Commission, along with other bodies in the city, are looking at that information as a way to spur developers to take more action.
Is there room with a potential ordinance to get to the point where there are performance standards or requirements?
That would be one of the approaches, that if we expanded the areas of jurisdiction, the type of resource areas, to expand buffer zones or some sort of resilience zones, they're called various things, and develop performance standards for them, then if we write a good ordinance, we could presumably require developers to meet those kinds of standards.
Have you currently, or do you now ever require any easements for, if there's a particularly vulnerable area, or to set aside as green infrastructure?
So currently, one thing that we have are called conservation restrictions, and those have to be added through the state. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head the process, but we do have that mechanism.
And what types of restrictions are those usually? Just not developing it, or is there?
Usually no build, no clear,
Okay.
that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there's potential with an ordinance both to expand the physical geography that's included in the jurisdiction with definitions and floodplain projections, but also to change the practices of what the Conservation Commission requires, theoretically moving into or adding performance standards and/or different types of restrictions or easements in addition to what happens now.
Yeah, I think there are many resource areas, even under the current law, that do not have performance standards. Mm-hmm. The advantage of performance standards will just be clarity. Mm-hmm. That everyone will just know what's required, and presumably that will both help both landowners in preparing their proposals, and obviously the commission too in evaluating their proposals.
And the fairness and efficiency that you described in the beginning,
yes.
too. Great. So I might have more, but I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. So I want to thank my team that did a little research going into this. I think the number they came up with was that the city oversees about 200 wetlands areas. Does that sound right? Ballpark?
Are we talking parcels or?
I think, yeah, parcels.
No, the number of parcels is much larger. Mm-hmm. It's the number of parcels that are affected probably go into the thousands.
Really? Okay. That's good to know. And then there's been little, this isn't a criticism, Carl, but it seems to me there's been little focus from your department in terms of picking up the banner in terms of crafting a ordinance, but there's certainly an appetite there. It's just you've had a.
There's certainly, I mean, as I mentioned, because it was included in both in our climate action plan and in Climate Ready Boston, we see that it could be a very effective tool.
Good.
So as I said, so we're very interested in in working with you.
Yep.
To explore this and see what we can come up with.
Okay, excellent. Councilor Flynn, you have questions?
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. I know in the city we are currently in one of the biggest ever building booms. I know we have current regulations for developers, but as you consider this issue, do you have any recommendations that you could make on how we can ensure everybody works closely, the developmenters, the people that are concerned about this issue and the impacted neighborhood, going forward? What are some of the steps we can take as a community or as a city?
Well, certainly to start off, just being aware of the issue, that since the mayor released our Climate Ready Boston report in 2016, we've completed some coastal resilience solutions for East Boston and Charlestown, and we're currently at work, as I think you know, Councilor, on developing plans for South Boston, and we'll be moving on to other areas of the city. So we're developing specific proposals that can provide neighborhood-based protection for sea level rise and coastal flooding. So that's very important. We are making our standards or what we want developers to address very clear in terms of new development. The climate checklist that we've already referred to this morning, we've asked, or this afternoon, excuse me, we're asking developers to look at the consequences of 40 inches of sea level rise and to describe to us how they are preparing their projects to cope with a level of flooding that we expect to occur then. And so this is one mechanism. There are no formal requirements, but we are looking for the development community to respond to that level of planning that we're using. And the BPDA, for example, has developed a tool so which anyone in the city can go and identify a parcel and see whether or not it's affected by flooding with 40 inches of sea level rise, and the extent of that flooding, so that they know exactly what we want them to start preparing for as they think ahead.
Thank you. And my final question is, are you engaging any neighborhood organizations about this issue, whether it be the Fort Point Neighborhood Association, giving them an update or educating them on exactly what is taking place, how they can be more active, more engaged? They do comment on this issue frequently, but is there an opportunity for you and your staff to make some visits into the various neighborhoods and engage the residents about this subject?
Oh, absolutely, though we're always looking for more opportunities. So if you have some suggestions, we welcome them. In the past 6 months, we've had 2 open houses in South Boston as part of the South Boston planning efforts, and high attendance. I think at the last one we had over 100 people from the community come and look at some of the proposals that we're being developed to develop resilience solutions for South Boston, and we want to continue that engagement with the community because we know how important it is.
Well, thank you for your outstanding work in the city. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. You had mentioned, or I think one of the questions Councilor Wu had asked is sort of about the process. When a developer is looking to build something that may be adjacent to a wetlands, there's certain criteria that the Conservation Commission outlines, correct? And it's the I think you said the state guidelines plus a site visit. That do they conduct their own sort of wetlands visit? Is there a person who's got a sterling reputation who can admit it? How does that work? Walk me a little bit more through that. In other words, we had a situation in West Roxbury where there was adjacent to Allendale Woods. In fact, there's a wetlands area which I believe is one of the 2 vernal pools in the city of Boston, and a developer was looking to develop several units there. I had grave concern, as did many of my neighbors. I believe he had 2 meetings at the Conservation Commission, and without getting into specifically his case, although perhaps I just did, can you just walk through what the process would be for that, specifically in terms of doing the state mandated guidelines and then the extra step that you all prescribe?
So with specifically, but not specifically, for something like that, the developer hires a wetland scientist.
And he or she does that on their own, but presumably it has to be a certified.
Yep.
Do we have many wetland scientists in the city?
We have a few agencies or consulting groups that do work for the commission.
And what precisely do they do, or what do we ask for them to do?
A wetland delineation. So to
Is
go
that like
out,
a land survey?
land survey, vegetation, habitat survey, things like that.
Okay.
If I may add, so as Amelia said, we look to the property owner or the developer to do present the initial information, and Amelia or her colleagues will always, or certainly usually, perform a site visit. If there's any question as in terms of what we've received from the applicant, we do, and as we do on occasion, we can hire our own wetlands expert to conduct an independent survey and check the information. And, we do that as necessary.
How often have we done that? Sorry.
I'd say probably about 10% of the time.
Okay. And what's the rule? Is if a lot is it 100 feet from a parcel? Is it 500? I forget what's the percentage of
We
distance?
currently have a 100-foot buffer zone
Okay.
for wetland resource areas, and that's subject under the Act.
Okay. Do you, to the best of your knowledge, that, or Carl, have other cities or towns who've adopted more stringent regulations increased that number? Is that part of one of the tools that can be done?
I presumably it can. I don't know. Amelia, do you know if other towns have done that?
I don't know if other towns have done that, no. Certainly none to my knowledge around here.
Okay. Well, to that end, it's, I think, a nice way to, I appreciate and stand with Councilor Wu in her work, and we're going to continue to delve into this. I think a nice complement to this, a work that we're also have been working on with your team, Carl, on net zero carbon and changing the building code, and perhaps we've talked about doing an environmental overlay district. We've talked about changing certain aspects of the building code. I think that this would dovetail nicely of both strengthening it, bolstering it, and making it more effective. So,
if I might just, I do want to point out one other important activity, which is not the same as this, but is closely related to the idea around a wetlands ordinance. I don't have the exact date, but in the last few weeks, the Boston Planning and Development Agency has opened an RFP for resilient open space, for a flood resiliency zoning overlay district and resiliency design guidelines. So in other words, how do we get these kinds of concepts of preparing for sea level rise and increased levels of flooding into the zoning code?
Yep.
Obviously, this is still the beginning of their process. It's also, but it's parallel to a possible development of a wetlands ordinance, and if we move forward with a wetlands ordinance, we would want to make sure that these two activities, both an ordinance and the zoning, are closely aligned so that their requirements are consistent and mutually reinforcing.
The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned, as it talks about good, sound environmental policy. So thank you for that. You, of course, can.
So,
Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on that note, in terms of codifying through zoning versus an ordinance, right now, if it were done through zoning, the BRA would be the entity, or the ZBA would be the entity to grant potential variances from that, in that case. And so a developer could theoretically, understand what the requirements are, but then ask for an exception. What would be the parallel for doing it through an ordinance? Is there a Concom appeals process or a variance, or?
Currently, our appeals process goes through the state, so if we were to deny a project for whatever reason, then they could appeal that to the state, DEP. If we were to have an ordinance, I believe that would have to go through Superior Court.
And I don't think, this is definitely not an either or. I mean, obviously, projects are already subject to zoning and are already subject to Conservation Commission jurisdiction, and they address different parts of a project, and I'm just saying that we would want to develop these two things in such a way that they, obviously that they don't conflict, but they work together to create, as both a fair and as a strong regime as we would like.
I completely agree, and I just think it's an important point to note that so I guess what I was trying to underscore in your statement was that having both is important as well, because relying just on zoning to do it still leaves open the door for a lot of different exceptions and one-off circumstances, many of which are valid, but in the face of climate change, sometimes it would seem to have more consistency and or teeth to have the second set of expectations through the Conservation Commission.
That's right. Of course, if we have an ordinance, there would be an appeals process built into it too. But
yes,
the two things do need to work together.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that all for this round?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you both. I'd invite you to stay if your schedules will allow, but we'll get you out of the hot seat there. But if you would mind just sticking around to hear from our next panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you for your good work. I'd like to invite up Pam Harvey, Deanna Moran, and David Morgan. Have these folks here.
Oh, I think Paul.
Is Paul Sutton here as well? If Paul is, you may join us. Mr. Sutton? That's you. All right. Well, thank you. I will deduce that you are David Morgan, so David, we'll start with you. And if you just want to briefly introduce yourself and say your affiliation, and then we'll go down, and then we'll go back if there's any opening statement before we get to Q&A.
Great. I am David Morgan. I'm a policy fellow in Councilor Wu's office. I am a graduate student at Tufts University and the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning Program, and I have been working on this ordinance the last 10 weeks or so. I have, in fact, drafted a copy of the ordinance, should that prove helpful in the future. It addresses many of the things that Commissioner Spector raised and that Amelia also raised in their testimony.
Before we get to your opening statement, let's just introduce the rest of the
go
panel, then we'll go back to you. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off.
Sure. I'm Pamela Harvey. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I'm here today representing the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions. I'm vice president for advocacy there. I'll mention as well, I'm a member of the town of Brookline, your neighbor to the west.
Excellent.
A member of their conservation commission.
Great. Thank you. You're on, yep. As long as it's red, we can hear
Okay.
you.
I'm Deanna Moran. I'm the Director of Environmental Planning at the Conservation Law Foundation. CLF is a regional nonprofit environmental advocacy organization headquartered here in Boston.
Great. All right. Well, welcome all. Thank you. And David, we'll start with you. You could finish off where I cut you off.
No problem. So briefly, the ordinance that I've put together would strengthen the areas that we've been discussing in more or less the ways that we've described. It would enable the city's Conservation Commission to require climate resilience planning in their permitting decisions and ensure that the city and private developers alike use the best available science to make their determinations in terms of permitting. One step further, I've hoped to allow the city to pursue more green infrastructure projects with this ordinance. And so to the extent possible, I've included language that is enabling in that way. To speak briefly to the performance standards that were raised earlier, specifically land subject to coastal storm flowage, Mass DEP is working on those right now, so there will be eventually regulations at the state level that are binding for us locally that move forward after the initial version of this wetlands ordinance was introduced back in 2013. So I know that's been discussed, it's out in the air, and at the state level they've started working on it. So to speak just to what I've drafted, there's kind of two sets of concerns that the ordinance would address. The first bucket is the strictly administrative, kind of bureaucratic concerns, things like size, definitions, setbacks, things of that nature, fees, permitting processes, et cetera, that we just kind of need to deal with at the administrative level to implement a local wetlands ordinance. And then the second is a bit more ambitious and even groundbreaking with the climate change resilience clauses, and those are more specific to the issues that we've raised so far, land subject, coastal storm flowage, and so forth. So there are two separate pieces to this. I think it comes together to form a pretty cohesive set of protections for the issues that we need to protect and the values, the wetlands values that we need to protect.
Thank you. Pamela?
Okay. I just want to say a couple words about MACC first, Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions. It is a statewide organization that was founded really in 1961, just a few years after the legislation passed to set up conservation commissions. And it plays a very important role in educating and advocating for conservation commissions around the state. Boston is a member. The prime constituency really is the 2,300 conservation commissioners in the state. The conservation commissions typically.
Does every state have does every city and town have one?
Yes, every single one does now. Yes, and almost all of their handful that aren't MACC members, I believe, due to budget shortfalls, but they're typically members of MACC. And we have a very large environmental conference every year. It's the largest environmental annual conference on the environment in New England, and we're the largest and most active statewide association of conservation commissions in the country. So it's an important group. And I think it's important to note that the conservation commissions and what they do and protection of open space and protection of wetlands is very important in this state. So historically, in addition to doing training and providing written materials, we do really encourage cities and towns to develop bylaws or ordinances in the case of cities. I apologize, sometimes I say bylaw instead of ordinance. There are
you're doing great.
more towns and cities. But in any event, in some ways, since towns have to get bylaws through town meeting, which can be sort of raise some difficulties that cities may not have with your councils. It's maybe a little different here, but in any event, they can be really handy for helping towns to tailor their wetlands protection to their local needs. As you know, the state law has resource areas and values that interests of the act, they're called, which are the values they're set up to protect. There are 8 of them, and I think they've been largely mentioned here. And then the regulations spell out, and most of the performance standards are not in the act itself, the Wetlands Protection Act. They're spelled out in DEP regulations, which are very voluminous. They're hundreds of pages long. They're very, very detailed, and they contain specific performance standards for each resource area. So you figure out what resource area that a project is going to affect, and then apply those performance standards. And the property owner would be expected to meet those performance standards. And it is, I do want to note, it is a permit process. So although a large land area can be subject to jurisdiction, people don't need to do anything unless they're going to do something that will alter a wetland, and they, have to send in an application for a permit. And typically, there's also a process called a determination of applicability that can be a little simpler, that may handle smaller projects or make a determination that's not subject to jurisdiction. So there is that. Just turning now to the role and importance of local bylaws and ordinances. When cities and towns choose to use their home rule authority, which is what it is to adopt an ordinance or bylaw, and as I think has been noted, almost 200 of the cities and towns in Massachusetts have done this, so it's quite a movement there. So a couple of things. First of all, the local bylaw ordinance has to be different and more stringent than state standards. You have to make sure you look to make sure that what you do in your ordinance is more stringent. It appears I have looked at this in some detail, and it seems like it definitely would meet that test. And also the appeals would go to, under a bylaw ordinance, go to court rather than to an appeal to DEP. But I also want to be clear that conservation commissions that are administering bylaws or ordinances, they're also administering the state law at the same time. And typically, you may think, oh, geez, that's going to be very complicated. But actually, the permit process is done sort of jointly. So there's one single hearing, and the same sorts of things are taken into account. And then the city or town that has a bylaw also considers any things that are different at the local level and issuing a permit. And their permits tend to be there's a sort of a tendency for there to be a narrative focus so that they can be upheld in an appeal to court. They can be defended. So that's just something I wanted to note because it is an important difference. So under an ordinance or the bylaw that the town adopts, commissions typically will issue their own regulations that will help implement it, and the details can be spelled out there. Often the commissions may make changes in their regulations without needing to go back and change the ordinance, and that can simplify things a bit. And then the things that are most commonly different under bylaws or ordinances are, and some of these have been noted, to expand or use different jurisdiction. An example of that would be many cities and towns add the buffer zone as a resource area. That's been pretty common. Adding interests or values. For example, recreation is also added as an interest of the act, which is not under one of the ones under the state law that's been upheld. Sometimes there are some changes in procedures, establishing fees. That's something that under the State Act, commissions get some fees, but not enough in the minds of some communities. And then clarifying grounds for issuing or denying a permit. Often they'll have some differences there. Anyway, MACC does have a model bylaw that some communities have used. It's been on the books for quite a while now and probably could use some updating as you've done to incorporate more about climate change in it. Anyway, but with that, I'll see if you have any questions for me.
Great, thank you. We certainly will in a second once
Okay.
Deanna gives any opening statement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We were really thrilled to get the invitation to come today. I was here several months ago on a very similar panel to talk about flooding in the city of Boston. And at that time, one of CLF's major priorities was that the city look at getting a wetlands ordinance over the finish line this year. Wetlands, as my colleagues have already said, local wetland ordinances, bylaws, and regulations provide municipalities with a fairly rare opportunity to improve on state minimum requirements by developing local wetland protections that not only are responsive to local conditions, but are also responsive to climate change. Because like with most of our state laws and regulations, the state's Wetland Protection Act does not contemplate climate change or the impacts that it'll have on wetland resource areas. And while the city of Boston has long been considered a leader in policy in Massachusetts, this is an area where I think we are noticeably behind our neighbors and behind other municipalities in the state. Over half of all municipalities in Massachusetts already have a wetland bylaw, ordinance, or regulation in place. To be fair, this is something that's been contemplated in the city of Boston for a while now, and there's been a lot of work done to take a look at this. It's stopped and stalled. Most recently, it was included as a recommended strategy in the 2016 Climate Ready Boston report, which is great. And I'm encouraged after hearing Carl and Amelia's testimony that it's still under consideration and being thought through, so that's great. Boston's adoption of a local wetlands ordinance is, in our view, really important for two reasons. One, many reasons, but the two main reasons. One, there are gaps in the current state Wetlands Protection Act that are better suited to be addressed locally in many cases. And in particular is a resource area that we've talked a lot about already, land subject to coastal storm flowage, which is a mouthful, but is essentially land that is subject to flooding, inundation, up to and including the 100-year storm or the storm of record. And so essentially it is the floodplain. And as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the floodplain, there's an enormous utility in preserving the natural capacity and function of the floodplain with or without climate change. But climate change has obviously made preserving that function much more important. Land subject to coastal storm flowage is actually the only resource area in the state law that does not have performance standards. And so many municipalities have taken it upon themselves to adopt performance standards for that resource area. And they do that in a variety of ways, but the good news is that there's a lot of precedent for us to look at how they've done it. As David and maybe also Pam mentioned, the state has also been looking at performance standards for these resource areas. I'll note that while it may be tempting to wait for the state to come out with their recommendations on performance standards, I think the city of Boston should move forward, regardless of the state process, mainly because the state has been considering performance standards for these resource areas since the 1990s. So again, has stopped and stalled, but that's where we are. And so second, our understanding of climate change is more sophisticated than it's ever been, including the impacts of sea level rise. We have at our fingertips, the newest, most actionable climate science, thanks in large part to the city's efforts through planning initiatives like Climate Ready Boston. And it's important that through a wetland ordinance like this, we acknowledge the utility in preparing for climate change in the context of public health and safety. It's very much a municipal responsibility to take that into consideration, and this is, very much an appropriate place to do that. And in particular, there are many cities and towns who are in the process of modernizing their either existing ordinances and bylaws or passing new ordinances and bylaws that explicitly acknowledge climate change and have standards that help to incorporate some of this forward-looking data, in particular around this issue of inland habitat migration, because as we see the shoreline shift in large part in response to sea level rise, we're going to see some of those wetland resource areas migrate inland. And for obvious reasons, if they don't have the space to migrate, we're in trouble. So we've seen many cities and towns start to account for that as well. So again, the good news is that there's many cities and towns who have already done this or are looking at this, and there's plenty of examples to look to. I think everyone in this room can agree that there's fairly broad consensus that there is a need for a wetland ordinance and regulations at the local level. I think what's less clear is how the relevant city departments and other stakeholders are coordinating to really make this an actionable item this year. We think it's extremely important that going forward, the development of any local wetland protection is coordinated among all the relevant city departments, the City Council, the Conservation Commission, and it incorporates all of the data and findings of ongoing parallel efforts, particularly Climate Ready Boston. So we look forward to continuing this conversation. CLF's available as a resource as needed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for your incredible insight, expertise, and work on this very important issue. This is a great panel. So I have a brief question for each of you. David, we'll start with you. Haven't read your ordinance yet, your proposal yet. Looking forward to reading it, and I'm sure it's very, very thorough. In your research, did you find a particular city or town in Massachusetts that was sort of your gold standard that you thought was the most effective and sort of groundbreaking, that was inspiration for some of the stuff you did, and talk a little bit about how that is working?
I would say that Arlington is probably at the leading edge of this issue. In fact, they developed regulations that only went into effect at the start of this year, roughly, the first couple of months of this year. And those are the most ambitious set that I've seen to date. Of course, there's the difference between putting it directly in an ordinance and then doing it in their regulations. Arlington already had a local wetlands ordinance in place, and so they chose to simply add climate resilience to their ordinance and then develop regulations.
So not only are we behind the ball, so to speak, but there are cities and towns that are now on their second iteration of their wetlands ordinance, strengthening it to address climate. Okay.
Right, that's true.
Interesting, but Arlington's good. So, Pam, you talked about sort of the template that you guys have. Is that, would you share what you know probably more about every city and town as it relates to this than others?
I think I would agree that Arlington has gotten the furthest on this. Some of I think a town in the Cape, I think it may be Falmouth, has added on a foot to the dune height or something, I think something like that. But anyway, it's important to keep in mind that cities and towns have different sort of needs as far as what to think about here. And Arlington, I think, had a lot of flooding concerns. I think it's the alewife up there that's causing trouble. Anyway, one specific thing they did was in land subject to flooding, bordering land subject to flooding along rivers, a developer has to give compensatory storage. So in other words, if there's going to be anything in the floodplain, they have to account for that to be sure that there won't be any overall flooding from it. So it's okay. I don't need to turn you into engineers. But in any event, one thing they did, specifically under the state regulations, it's a requirement that the volume loss be compensated a 1-to-1 ratio, and they increased that ratio to 2-to-1. So it's an example in an ordinance of getting more, being sure that you're going to have more protection from flooding.
And if they violate, do they pay into that when you say?
It's not a money thing. So now we're in the weeds.
That's all right. We love it.
In any event, if something's going to be a development's going to be put in the floodplain. It's physically in the floodplain. You have to compensate for it by providing some volume that's not going to be in the floodplain.
So I
Otherwise, you
see.
don't get a permit.
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So but it's just an example of
Yeah.
going beyond what the state requirement was.
Yeah. I like that. Okay.
Yeah. And they also have a requirement about vegetation, that trees of greater height be replaced. So instead of, so that you have enough shade, and which really helps with heat effects.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So, trees are another thing that are lost to development. You may not think about them right away because you don't think of trees necessarily in the context of wetlands, but there is often loss of trees
No
when a
question.
developer does a project, so that's.
We're also working on the tree canopy in Boston and how that seems to be a bit
Yeah,
sputtered, I
yeah,
guess. So
yeah,
I think
yeah,
it,
yeah.
talk about the ecosystem, it's literally, the whole like ecosystem.
And they also have some additional stormwater management requirements to take climate change impacts in the future into account.
Good.
So they've got to, I think it may be true that the draft goes a little further, but I think it's probably entirely appropriate because the city is very vulnerable.
How long have you been on the Berkland Conservation Commission?
I have been a member now for about 3 years, and then before that, I spent 24 years at the Department of Environmental Protection, doing some administrative law work, but also I did a lot of writing of regulations, so it's a personal interest of mine as well.
Absolutely.
But I couldn't serve on the commission at the same time.
Sure,
So
no,
I was an
understood.
associate member for many years, actually, before
Excellent.
becoming a full member.
And do you meet in Brookline's Town Hall?
Yes, we do.
So you appreciate the beauty of this type of architecture
yes.
that you're sitting in right now?
Yes.
I love it. Thank you. Deanna, talk a little bit about sort of the second point you talked about, performance standards, and I guess it's a similar question, but maybe CLF has a different perspective to it. Talk about what performance standards would make our eventual, Councilor Wu's eventual proposal solid and effective.
Yeah. I'll emphasize Pam's point that local conditions matter a lot, and in the context of Boston, especially because we are in the midst of a pretty big development boom, there would need to be some robust conversation about what the impacts of any performance standards would be. And so I don't know that we can, directly import performance standards from other cities and towns, but at its foundation, the purpose of performance standards for specifically land subject to coastal storm flowage is important, because when you see a lot of these waterfront development proposals come forward, many of them are affecting land subject to coastal storm flowage. But because there are no performance standards, they're not being required to do some of the things that Pam was just talking about, like providing mitigation, compensatory or otherwise. And that, to us, seems like a little bit of a loophole in the development process right now. So having some more robust standards for what can actually be built in those resource areas. There are cities and towns who restrict the types of uses that can go there. There are cities and towns who tie a lot of climate-related issues to the performance standards of land subject to coastal storm flowage. So, for example, not prohibiting any structures below base flood elevation or requiring developers to consider future sea level rise in the development of their projects, so similar to what's required under the checklist, and things like that. Again, I think it would have to, it would be very situational to Boston in terms of what's proposed and what makes the most sense, but having a little bit more of a hook in the development proposal process, I think would be really valuable. And to Michelle's point, we have the BPDA process, we have the zoning process, there's an appeal process there, there's a variance process there. Having the Conservation Commission as a bit of a backstop on some of that waterfront development and having some additional standards that are mandatory and have their own appeals process, but arguably one that's a little bit more robust and different procedurally than the BPDA process could be really valuable in making sure that whatever is developed in those floodplains is responsible development.
Good. That's a good answer. Appreciate that. Thank you. Councilor Wu?
Thank you. So I wanted to start with this idea of a piece of legislation that we're passing once in kind of a static view, matched with constantly changing projections of sea level rise and impacts in science. And David, I think, mentioned it in the beginning of how do you have the best available. So in the draft ordinance, do you get at that by mentioning, you're using as the standard best available measures of precipitation frequency statistics and 500-year flood frequency event period? Are those constant? So the first one is a constantly adjusting, but for example, the 500-year flood, is that constantly being adjusted too, or is that frozen in time? Just as a basic understanding of how the state and others do it.
So the extent of the 100 and the 500-year floodplain will evolve over time because of impacts like sea level rise. So in that respect, they are not static, which is
But
one of...
are we using a definition or that's set by a different agency and that they're not changing it as frequently as would be ideal?
Yeah, so right now, most of these types of regulations reference FEMA maps.
Okay.
So it would be FEMA's definition of a 100-year floodplain or a 500-year floodplain, which does not take into consideration climate change, which is one of the limitations of using that as the standard.
And how often do they adjust even their sort of retroactive-looking maps?
It depends. Boston's, I believe, was updated in 2016, but there are a lot of other criticisms for how FEMA develops those maps, particularly that they don't include all of the processes that would affect the vulnerability of certain lands, including things like erosion. So there's a question as to whether or not even the retrospective maps and based on historical rates are as accurate as they really need to be, let alone accurate for development that will be around for 50 to 60 years.
Is there another potential reference point or metric that would be more dynamic that could be used instead of that? Or that other cities have already been using in their legislation?
There's a part of the ordinance that I put together, thanks to CLF's help, that refers to special transition zones, and that is particularly meant to address salt marsh migration. And so that is a more dynamic evaluation of a resource area that necessarily migrates, and with sea level rise will need to move further inland. So there are ways of dynamically defining the resource areas to adjust with change.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right on point. And the other thing I think maybe worth mentioning here is that typically, the 100-year storm event is what's used, and this proposes to go to the 500-year storm event. So just by doing that, you
Already
have more
are-
of a buffer for yourself.
Got it. Okay. And then just to touch a little, following up on Councilor O'Malley's line of questioning around performance standards, are we talking about, we had an exchange with the administration specifically about the coastal stormwater flowage vulnerable areas and not having performance standards. Would we be looking to change and/or set the performance standards for other resource areas as well? And again, how do you get at sort of staying ahead of the curve with the standards? Is it all the same thing, tying it back to some relationship to whatever metric we're using in terms of FEMA?
To my knowledge, land subject to coastal storm flowage is the only resource area under state law that does not have performance standards. So in terms of setting, it would just be that one.
But the others are just floors that we could build upon.
Correct, yes. As long as whatever is passed locally is more stringent,
Yeah.
you have a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
And DEP, after a very long delay, did come out, I don't know, maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago, with a draft for of regulations for land subject to coastal storm flowage. So there has been some movement there, and I think they do intend to move forward. So in a way, this timing is good, because you'll see what they do, and then, if you're going to do something different, you'd want it to be more stringent. Actually, just changing it from the 100-year storm to the 500-year storm probably would be jurisdictionally more stringent. So. But anyway, there has been some movement there.
And I think it was Pamela who had mentioned Concom's, the commissioners need to administer both sets of federal and state, local and state laws, but that because you're doing it, it might have been, I can't remember, but you're doing it in one sitting, in one meeting, so that it's not necessarily more burdensome. Is that, I guess, could you go into that a little more? How much additional training would our commissioners need, or other resources, technical assistance, to be able to have our existing structures, administrative structures, now take on this enhanced jurisdiction and/or set of legislations they would be enforcing?
Yeah, typically, once the application comes in, there is a timetable, and so typically under the state law, it's fairly tight. So there has to be a public hearing within 21 days. I mean, things move fairly promptly. So that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a little tough, but anyway, but it's a good thing. And so typically, bylaws are set up to meet the same timetable, and there's a joint public notice under the state and the bylaw, so that makes it simpler. And then the hearing is in the staff reviews, but so typically it's kind of a joint application too. And then there's additional material for anything that may be different under the bylaw. So, and then the hearing is a hearing under both the state law and the bylaw. And then again, the applicant at the hearing may discuss how the project is designed to conform to the state regulations, and then we'll address anything additional that will come up under the bylaw. An example is in Brookline, we have a 150-foot buffer zone rather than a 100-foot buffer zone, so there may be some additional area that's under jurisdiction under the bylaw, and the applicant's consultant will discuss that. And then typically I think most communities use the department's what's called an order of conditions. That's what the permit's called. We'll use that, and then there's additional pages at the end for any additional conditions under the bylaw. And I think it's often done that way. Communities obviously can do different things if they want to, but typically it's handled that way. So it's not like two separate permitting processes. It is true that under the state regulations, if an applicant's unhappy with the permit, or other entities, their appeal rights to others as well, can request what's called a superseding order, a different permit from DEP, and then if they're unhappy with that, there can be an appeal to an adjudicatory hearing, and that can go to court. Under a bylaw, the appeal is directly to court. And so commissions do want to take some time to keep that in mind when they make their decision. I think it's fair to say that sometimes commissions will settle with an applicant before it actually gets to court, and in the court it's on the record review, so it's not typically an entire trial. So they just the applicant, the commission put on their case and get a decision.
Great. Okay, well, I mean, the good news, as you all have mentioned, is that there are lots of templates and examples to follow with other cities and towns and how they make the transition.
Yeah.
So I guess my final question is, any recommendations you have in terms of process of moving forward, mostly around how Boston should arrive at the most suitable balance for us as a municipality of protection versus development and the city's economy, or we'll hear the "don't kill the golden goose" line a lot, but faced with this very real threat of climate change. So what are the types of processes that have worked in terms of bringing residents in, the business community, developers? I think having a draft from David is and now there's at least a starting point to talk about this in a much more concrete way. But what would you recommend come next?
I mean, I would be very curious to see where the city is in their processes, because my understanding is that they're kind of on a parallel track looking at this issue. So I think it would be really important to reconcile what's ever been done at the city council level with what's happening with other city departments. Obviously, really important to bring in all the various stakeholders that want a seat at the table, including real estate interests, but also the environmental community and neighborhood organizations and others. I think ultimately the maximum amount of coordination really needs to happen between city council and city departments that are intimately involved with implementing the regulations.
I guess there are two things that I might offer here. One is that to the extent to which there may be concern about increased jurisdiction, some communities have sometimes you can look at and put in regulations things that are sort of minor activities that people can do, provided they do them in certain ways, and then they don't need to apply at all, so that can be a handy tool. There's some of those in the DEP's regulations. Actually, they weren't for decades, and then they got put in a while ago, but that's been helpful. And some communities also have a administrative review process, so people can talk to the commission's agent and inquire about what they want to do and whether or not it's subject to jurisdiction, so that can help. So I think if you have some ways that, for people who are concerned about being under jurisdiction that might not have been before, I think that can ease things. And I think the other thing about Boston that's a little different than many communities is that, you know, Boston's pretty fully developed now, and a lot of projects will be coming up, and this is my view, and we haven't had a lot of discussions at MACC about this, but this did come up under the Rivers Protection Act, where there were new stringent regulation. The act required a lot of stringent regulations along rivers, and often they tend to be highly developed too. So I think it's important to kind of think through how it will work in the context of redevelopment, because you want to make sure that you don't have performance standards that are strict, and then there's a disincentive to go in and redevelop it. So just an example, for the riverfront area under the Rivers Protection Act, there's a particular provisions for redevelopment rather than the otherwise applicable performance standards. And the bottom line there is you have to improve existing conditions. So that's a good thing to have that in there. So that's something you can think about doing, and it may, I haven't really kind of thought this through, but it may work for other contexts within the city.
I would only reiterate what my fellow panelists have said, so.
Wonderful. So the only thing I forgot to mention earlier is that we did get some questions, particularly from Fenway, about how this would apply to the fens and invasive species there. The organizations and community leaders really wanting to have reassurance that this wouldn't mean that any area around wetlands would be sort of frozen from any activity, and that the goal that they have to make sure that the native plants are restored and invasive species managed would not be at odds with this. And I believe your draft actually, in fact, already has a specific exclusion for that. So I did want to put that on the record.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I have one final question, but it's a tough one. And we're going to start with you, David. What is your and we're going to go down. What is your favorite wetlands area in the city of Boston?
Great question. I'm going to go with the Boston Harbor Islands because I want to consider the ways that we can expand nature-based solutions for sort of shoreline protection out there. And I am sort of planning my thesis on that subject.
That's an excellent answer. So good answer. I look forward to. I hope to read your thesis when you're done. Pamela, I know you're a Brookline resident, but right over, I can think of one between Jamaica Plain and Brookline that I used to love to go to, or still love to go to. But what would be your favorite?
I spend a lot of time in the fens, and I spend a lot of time there. I spend a lot of time on the Charles River. So it's
Me too. It's a beautiful place. Deanna?
David and Pam took both of mine. The Harbor Islands was my first choice, and Charles River was my second. I live right behind Charles River, so I don't think I could ever live too far from the Esplanade. But I would have to get back to you with a third one.
All right. Well, we'll save it for the next time. But thank you all. This was really, really helpful, really, really informative. That is all I think we have for this panel. I don't have any, I see some dear friends in the audience who I thought for certain would be testifying, but I don't have anyone who has signed in and asked to testify. If any, I see a hand raised. So anyone who would like to testify, just please, you are the first. Line up behind this gentleman at one of those two podiums behind me. And if you could just join us and then say your name and affiliation. This panel can leave if you're welcome to sit and listen to the public testimony from those chairs, but you're welcome to sit in a more comfortable off the hot seat as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Excellent. So if you could just say your name,
Sure.
affiliation, if you have any, could be resident, and then we'd like to keep it to about 2 minutes per person for the public
Sure.
testimony, so please.
Great. Yeah, hi, my name's Julie Wood. I'm with the Charles River Watershed Association, so thanks to the panel for giving some props to the Charles. I will try to keep it short, and we anticipate submitting written comments as well. First of all, I just want to express in general our support for Boston to pass a local wetlands ordinance. As many folks have brought up, it is become the norm for communities, and that is true for communities across the watershed. So we're happy to see Boston pursuing this and hope that it can come to fruition sooner rather than later. It's great to see that the city is acknowledging the importance of its natural systems to the city's quality of life, as well as to the city's ability to adapt to climate change. It is wonderful also to see the innovative approach to this wetlands to combine protection of wetlands with adaptation to climate change. I particularly like the word cumulative that I read throughout this draft ordinance because that does tend to be how we see impacts occur to our natural systems. It's not just one project or one-off. It is definitely the cumulative nature of projects, one after the other. There's been a lot of discussion about the land subject to flooding. I would just like to add freshwater flooding to that discussion. Most of the focus has been on coastal flooding and coastal inundation, which is of course important, but the main tributary to the lower Charles River is the Stony Brook, which is essentially completely underground. So that would not fall under this ordinance as written, is my understanding. But the Stony Brook is indeed a water resource in the city of Boston. And if you look at the climate projections for stormwater flooding that have come out of the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, you'll see that a lot of the potential flooding is in that Stony Brook system. So that is something to keep in mind, that it's not just coastal flooding, it is also stormwater flooding, and stormwater flooding can occur outside of the resource area as typically mapped. Again, support for the mention of migration zones. Those are great that those have been acknowledged. Those are certainly critical. Second, the support for allowing restoration opportunities and even potentially waiving of fees for nonprofits that are undergoing restoration opportunities. The Muddy River is our most visible tributary in the lower Charles, and it's a great spot, wonderful spot, beautiful spot, but it does have a major problem with Phragmites and other invasives. And so the part that it was recently daylighted now looks beautiful. We'd love for the rest of the Muddy River to look that beautiful. So just keeping in mind that the resource area, important to protect it, also important to allow for enhancements to it. So that's great to see that this doesn't intend to provide a barrier there. I think the buffer zones are good, 200 feet, as well as the 500-year use of the 500-year flood standard. Many communities do use a local wetlands ordinance to actually have these requirements apply to the entire community. I understand that may be overload in a dense city like Boston, but there are towns and cities who have decided to do that. And then a point that was made on the previous panel that I would like to echo is encouraging redevelopment or infill development, especially with the limited nature of green space, open space, undeveloped land in Boston, to the extent that we can preserve what we have and infill in other neighborhoods that need development. I think that can be a win-win for the environment and for the economy. So thank you very much. Happy to be here today to support this.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. Sir?
Hello, my name is Tony Lacasse. I live in Rosendale. I'm a member of the Friends of Allendale Woods. And I'd want to, number one, just thank Councilors Wu and O'Malley for bringing up the consideration of having an ordinance. This is really critical because, as we've seen in terms of the testimony here so far, Boston is way behind the curve in terms of wetlands protection. And what we were seeing as well is that not only in respect to the development boom that's going on, particularly in the neighborhoods away from the waterfront, there's a need for critical freshwater wetlands protection. For both of your neighborhoods, in terms of which I'm involved in, probably some of the three of the biggest and most controversial neighborhood developments in West Roxbury, Rosendale, and Jamaica Plain in the last year have all been concerning wetlands areas that are being encroached upon by really what is pretty unacceptable development proposals. One of the things that I think is critical in terms of being able to put this in an ordinance versus putting it into the Zoning Act is that the culture of development has been so overwhelming in terms of city government that we're just seeing proposals that are outrageous that would be in any other municipality. And what happens is that developers, even in their comments in terms of public hearings, talk about just going through the process with an expectation that whatever they propose in terms of building out 90% of a wetlands buffer zone would be normal and would be accepted. And so one of the things that I think will be important is that the ordinance will have extra teeth. The kinds of proposals that have happened at 1225 Center Street, which is on, basically that is immediately adjacent to one of Boston's last two vernal pools in Allendale Woods. 64 Allendale, a proposal to build 18 multi-million-dollar condominiums immediately upslope with about a 75 permeability coverage on a steep slope. That was granted 55 variances by the ZBA on a 2-acre parcel. Pretty hard to do. I could probably give some of the grad students here the challenge of trying to be able to do that, and they'd have a hard time doing that. In both cases, they're just illustrative of the fact that there's not any serious consideration outside of the Conservation Commission in looking at these wetlands issues. These are proposals that should not even be coming forward because they wouldn't come forward in terms of any other development culture in any other municipality in the Commonwealth. But they come forward because they are, one of the things that happens with wetlands is they're attractive spaces. They are places that people want to live because they're usually near natural environments. And in this case, we see that we literally have a willingness to love them to death for profit and then to be able to leave. The Friends of Allendale Woods and the Rosendale Wetlands Task Force had submitted a letter for the written record, but I'm just here to also add some things on a personal note that I think, learning from the prior testimony, that I'd like just to both amplify and look to see that if they could be included in the ordinance. Number one is that one of the things regarding vernal pools is that Boston is actually a pretty large city in terms of its physical dimensions. We are now left with 2 vernal pool sites, one in Allendale Woods, and we've got a group of them in the Stony Brook Reservation. And what was so amazing to people was that we could so casually consider the immense kind of development that was just, running roughshod over both zoning and wetlands considerations. It's the kind of thing that we need to be able to embed into the ordinance, that vernal pools are protected and that the buffer zones around them are not negotiable. But another key aspect, it's unfortunate that Paul Sutton with Boston Parks is not here today, but Paul actually is very knowledgeable on what are the best practices around vernal pools throughout, in terms of planning organizations, both in the Commonwealth and around the country. One of the key aspects of that in terms of the vitality of maintaining an ecosystem like a vernal pool, which is a seasonal freshwater pond that is going to support an inordinate amount of amphibian and amphibian and bird and a lot of other life. In fact, its biomass often exceeds an area of, let's say we have a 1 acre pond, the biomass in that vernal pool will usually exceed the biomass in terms of weight of the 4 surrounding acres. It's incredibly important in terms of that. So one of the things that we need to do and we need to embed into the ordinance is the protection of the upland habitats around there. The particular guidelines that Paul has made reference to in the past in neighborhood meetings show that if you don't protect the upland habitat, your protections for the vernal pool will probably go for naught. That over time, the vernal pool will decline if you don't protect the upland habitat around it. So that would be another thing that we'd like to be able to see happen around that. The other thing that we'd like to do is there is immense confusion, and actually there's a lot of legal play on the part of attorneys for developers to be able to bypass or to create confusion around wetlands enforcement. Particularly in the case of 1225 Center Street this past year, we've been told historically that that developers, in terms of looking for wetlands exceptions, needed to move through the neighborhood process before they could go to Conservation Commission. They actually began at Conservation Commission, and actually Conservation Commission to be lauded for it, they gave a lot of tough questioning in those first steps. But the response on the part of the attorneys there was to always seek the technical fix, to be able to look for them to approve the exception, to be able to then go with the technical fix. Problem with that is that when we're talking about one of the last 2 vernal pools in Boston, it makes no sense to be putting that at risk for what is not a very significant development. The other aspect of that is that these technical fixes, they're easy for the developer to put in, but they require that the condo associations often be able to keep up really expensive maintenance issues. So if that's permeable pavement in terms of the ability to be able to not only vacuum and clean that, in terms of bioswales, being able to bring in freshwater ecologists and landscapers who are qualified to be able to maintain those, or in the cases of like 1225 Center, we were looking at very sophisticated runoff mitigation efforts. And all of those are going to be taking dollars from a condo association. For those who've ever lived in the setting of a condo association, we all know that it just takes a couple neighbors in that setting to be able to not afford that, and they might have good reason not to. But in those cases, that's where we'd also need to embed in the ordinance that if we were going to make exceptions to that, those condo associations are obliged to be able to demonstrate that the performance of those mitigating technical fixes is maintained and it's ongoing, because those are the kinds of things that are forgotten over decades. And then when we are going to have these greater precipitation events and those functions fail, then we'll have the impacts that we are concerned about. My last point that I just wanted to be able to make was I also think that it's really important that we just really make a statement about the importance of freshwater wetlands in the upland neighborhoods of Boston. And I think the ordinance is going to be able to do that, but we really have to be able to get out of the game of relying on citizen groups to do the work of what city agencies should be doing. There's a few hundred people in the Rosendale, West Roxbury, and Jamaica Plain neighborhoods that have literally spent about $50,000 so far, and thousands of hours of their own time raising money, attending neighborhood meetings that they shouldn't have to attend. That these proposals are so outrageous and so egregious in terms of what's proposed next to these wetlands that we need to be able to break that culture. Because the problem with it is that it creates a mistrust of city government. The feeling is that developers in the current culture have now moved where they know they can get whatever, the variances are granted so liberally that now we've stepped back to the 1970s where wetlands laws were just being introduced and educated. And at this point, they're going at that in practice. They're going after the wetlands laws as well in respect to Boston. And we don't have a lot of wetlands to begin with. We should be protecting what we have in their significance. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. Appreciate your work. Would anybody else like to testify who hasn't signed up? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for testifying, for coming down today. Thank you, Carl Spector, Amelia Croto. Thank you to our second panelists, Pamela Harvey, Deanna Moran, David Morgan. Thank you, Julie Wood and Tony Lacasse, for your public testimony. And thank you, Councillor Wu, for your leadership on this issue. It goes without saying, I'm enormously supportive continued efforts and whatever the next step will be, which I have a pretty good feeling of what it will be. From your perspective, it's high time that we, and I've been proud to partner with you on so many effective environmental initiatives, and this is just another one that's going to go to that goal, and agree with so much that has been said by our experts, by our panelists, the importance of protecting these, both freshwater and saltwater wetlands, every aspect of it, our natural bodies of water, particularly those in the outside neighborhoods. Hello, Councillor Edwards. We're just wrapping up, but you can say hello. Thank you for being here. Again, just appreciate the efforts and know we have a lot of work to do and looking forward to rolling up our sleeves and getting it done. So that is all I have. Councillor Wu, any concluding remarks? Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you all. Enjoy the day. It looks like the weather may be cooperating now, so stay dry. And this hearing is hereby adjourned.